Welcome everybody. I'm Peter Larson. I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and I'm thrilled this afternoon to be talking to Michael Bueckart, who is the vice president of the Canadians for Peace, Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Michael, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me this afternoon.
Thanks so much. It's great to have a chance to talk about this report.
Yeah, so move right to the issue here. CJPME just came out with I think a fairly significant statement, a direction on where you think Canadian policy ought to be going with respect to the Israel-Palestine issue. It had 6 main recommendations. Some were less controversial than others, and some were more controversial than others. And I'd like to focus in on what I think was a very significant development, and they're all very useful. But you are arguing now that the Canadian government should not be privileging a two-state solution as the only solution to the Israel-Palestine issue. First, let me just remind us why you came to that conclusion, and then I'll ask you some questions about it.
Well, I think this report comes out of lots and lots of conversations over the years with many people. In a way, it's nothing new, but it's formalizing and solidifying some of the ideas and sort of perspectives that we've been working with for a while. So, for example, for years, people have been raising concern that, we're just on the cusp of the death of a two-state solution. We're always almost there at the death of the possibility of creating an independent Palestinian state next to an Israeli state. And what I guess this report tries to do is take that seriously. What if the two-state solution is dead or dying? What does that actually mean for Canadian foreign policy? Well, if it's true, if our gut feeling, many of us are gut feeling about this, or perspective based on being to the region and seeing the facts on the ground, if that's true, then we need to take that seriously. And we have to challenge and push our politicians so that they're not simply continuing to reiterate talking points about a two-state solution while the possibility of that has passed. Right. And the danger of that, of course, is not just delaying justice, but also that by seeing the two-state solution as the only possible outcome, it closes us off to the conversation that is happening, particularly among Palestinians and Israelis and many other people, about what an alternative just outcome could look like that respects the equal rights and freedoms of all people. And so
okay, so let me one of the big issues to deal with is that, as you and I know, today there is no significant Palestinian political party that's not arguing for a two-state solution, whether it's Hamas, whether it's PA, whether it's PLO, even the Arab Joint List, they all say the two-state solution is the answer. So do you not have some qualms about saying that they're wrong and we Canadians are right? I mean, I realize, of course, that there are voices in Palestinian society and even in Israeli society, but for the moment, there's still very definitely minority views, or maybe you disagree with that assessment.
Well, I mean, like if you looked at polling, it would be all over the place on this question. Certainly, from one poll to the next, the sort of support for like a one-state solution could be small, could be large. I think some recent polling by B'Tselem suggests that at the very least, nobody on either side of the green line, looking at both populations, were polled. No one thinks that Israel is meaningfully pursuing a policy towards two-state solution. Right. So I think there's a lot of sort of baked in commitments, I think, especially among political parties, which themselves have very little, there's a lot of criticism and dissent in Palestine, certainly, towards political parties like Fatah, or like especially towards the Palestinian Authority. So how legitimate are those voices being seen? I think that's sort of being eroded. But I mean, regardless, we're not saying what the solution should be. That's not our role as a solidarity group. But I do think that the position of our government and our political parties has to be more representative of the conversations that are happening. And so I think our recommendations, you can look at these recommendations and follow them and take them seriously, while also continuing to support a two-state solution and think it's, the preferable option. But what we're saying is that it can't be a barrier to action. It can't be an excuse to justify sitting around and waiting for negotiations to happen. And it can't be privileged as something if that means that alternatives are going to be off the table, or we're not even going to look at them. And so certainly it's a tricky question, and it's not, obviously the international community cannot be the ones to promote any particular solution, I think.
Except, and I think you agree, we have. I mean, we
Right.
have basically said, we, the international community, including Canada, the United States, have said to the Palestinians for X number of years, the only answer we'll accept is a two-state solution. So it
Right.
makes it very difficult to have a thoughtful conversation amongst Palestinians if they believe that the
Right.
international community would only solve one, because they know they can't solve this without the support from the international community. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think with sort of the conversation around the two-state solution, if the goal, if you're really committed to that goal, I think the sort of the negotiating position is so unequal that if negotiations were actually taking place and it was sort of a compromise reached, it would be such a small fraction that Palestinians would receive. It's almost impossible to imagine that it would be fair and that would be an equal state that could emerge out of that situation. I actually think that if people actually think that the two-state solution is necessary, they should be pushing for a one-state, because a two-state could end up being a useful compromise, but we won't get a compromise that's fair and just for everyone by starting from a position of such power imbalance.
And so what you're saying there is that, I mean, first of all, I think everybody knows that the final solution will be a compromise, whatever it is. I mean, it's, but it's not really appropriate for Canada to start off by saying, well, it's going to be a compromise, and here's the compromise we think you should start negotiating from. That's basically the position you're arguing. Okay.
Also, I think part of the problem too is defining. We're trying to have a conversation too about what does a two-state solution actually mean? What would it look like? How could it be fair? I think from our perspective, a solution to the conflict, it either has to respect equal rights, or there has to be equal, independent, fully sovereign states. So currently, I think the discourse around the two-state solution has been so, I think, trapped in the sense that Israeli politicians, when they talk about two states, even those politicians who say they support a two-state solution, that's not actually what they mean. They support an Israeli state and a Palestinian state minus, or an entity that is not quite a state. And to my eyes, that does not sort of look like a sovereign state that has control over its own destiny. It doesn't look like self-determination. It looks like a Bantustan along the lines that South Africa tried to create in the 70s and 80s, these nominally independent self-governing bodies that were an excuse to continue apartheid by their means, by pushing the undesirable population into what they would call a state, but would ultimately be subordinate to South African sovereignty. And that's ultimately what I see a lot of the two states. When a lot of people say they support two states, that's actually what they mean. They do not support an independent Palestinian state. And I just think that if it turns out that a two-state solution is the route that we are, if that ends up being the result, it has to be an actual state. It cannot be anything less than that.
Well, I mean, when you look at the geography of the area, I mean, I think some people might argue that the West Bank is a Bantustan, irrespective. I mean, quite apart from areas A, B, and C, and so on and so forth. I mean, all the best land, except in the Jordan Valley, all the best land was taken over by Israel, and the Palestinians fled to the poorest land in the West Bank and so on. Now, you also claim one of your 5 points, 6 points, is that Canada should continue to press for the recognition of the State of Palestine. Now, I find this to be kind of a contradiction, because if you press for the recognition, if we should press for a recognition of the State of Palestine, presumably you're not assuming that that state will be over all of historic Palestine. That means you are also pressing for the recognition of the State of Israel, which we know will be a Jewish state, which means that the refugees will not be able to return, and that the Palestinians who live there will not be equal citizens. So it seems to me, sorry, that you're sort of pushing a little bit on both ends of this. There's a contradiction there. And how do you respond to that?
Well, there's a contradiction in recognizing Palestinian statehood to begin with, as it currently is. Currently, I forget the number, but well over 100 member states of the United Nations recognize the State of Palestine. The State of Palestine has observer status at the UN. It's acceded to the International Criminal Court. It has status at all these international bodies. None of that is related to the viability of statehood on the ground. None of that is related to whether there actually is a Palestinian state.
Right.
It's a symbolic.
It's aspirational. Yeah.
It's aspirational. It's symbolic.
Yeah.
What's useful about it is that it provides Palestinian representatives with increased diplomatic power, the ability to pursue war crimes investigations at the ICC.
Right.
It tries to level the balance of power a little bit, and to give them more opportunities on the international stage. I think that's fine. None of that says that there actually is a state, and therefore I don't really see that. It's obviously contradictory, but I don't think that if Canada recognized the status of the State of Palestine, that would not prevent. Obviously, that doesn't automatically mean that there's a state in Palestine. Neither would it automatically prevent a new situation coming out of negotiations, coming out of a political solution, whether one state or two, which would replace the current diplomatic status. So obviously, it's a tricky thing to work with, but I don't think that people who, like if I'm looking at what Palestinians are saying, they're not saying don't pursue Israeli war crimes at the ICC because Palestine's not a state. They're saying use what tools are available to us, and I think that's what Canada should do.
When Peter Bueckart came out 6 or 8 months ago with what was at that point a blockbuster article saying why I no longer believe in a Jewish state, a New York Times article, I'm sure you read it.
Oh yeah, of course.
He said subsequently that all kinds of people dumped on him and criticized Jews, liberal Zionist Jews, saying that they support a two-state solution and so on and so forth. And he said his response to a lot of them was, well, if you do support a two-state, why haven't you done anything about it? I mean, if you really do support a two-state solution, then you should be complaining about the settlements. You should be talking about, and I would think that would be a similar argument to make to the Canadian government. If you really believe in a two-state solution, why is it when cultural facilities in East Jerusalem are shut down? Or why is it when, it took a long time for them to comment on Sheikh Jarrah and so on. I think we should be potentially asking the Canadian government to say, if you really believe this, why don't you do something about it?
I agree. And I think that it's maybe more implicit in our report than explicit. Maybe we could have expanded on this, but this is a starting point. And I do think that regardless of where MPs sit on the question of what they see as a more just outcome or their preferred outcome, I think either way, we need to be pressing for immediate action in support of upholding international law and protecting human rights, which every day are under threat, and making sure that if the Canadian government supports a two-state solution, it needs to actually put some actions behind it, and force actions that would be consistent of that. So that's sort of the bottom line, is that it just can't be. I think the way that the government sees the goal of a two-state solution is that it's we're going to wait for negotiations, and then anything that happens outside the negotiations, whether it's settlement expansion or it's Palestine getting statehood status at the UN, those are seen as equal unilateral actions in the way of peace. And I just think that is a ludicrous way to approach this situation. We shouldn't just be building a Palestinian civil society and not addressing Israeli crimes, which, you know, it makes no sense the way that the Canadian diplomatic approach is.
The argument is used that we can't do those things because it's going to derail the peace process or whatever. So.
Oh, right. And there is no peace process.
Right. Now, I have the final thing I want to pursue with you, I think, is you focus on the Canadian government, but as you know, every Canadian political party supports this mantra of a two-state solution, whether it's the NDP, the Green Party, the Bloc Party, Bloc Québécois, and not only do all political, the United Church supports it, the Catholic Church says it's for the Anglican Church, most of the human rights organizations that dabble in this have attached themselves firmly to this two-state solution mantra. So how are we or you going to deal with that? Because if you go and tell MPs they shouldn't be glued onto the two-state solution, but the United Church, which has, for which I have a great deal of respect, but if the United Church is still saying, no, the two-state solution is the best answer, we've got some work to do.
Yeah, and this is the start of a conversation, but I hope that whether, whether people support one state or two state, that there's, the key is that we can't let our future negotiations and waiting for that become an excuse not to take action now. And I think a lot of people have, because there's such a sort of international consensus, at least at a sort of a top level around two-state solution as maybe the only option. I think that has become sort of a mantra, and I don't know if everyone really believes it. I think people think that they have to say that, and that's sort of the only thing. It sounds fair, but I think a lot of people are following this know that conditions on the ground make the possibility of two states really unlikely, implausible at this point. And I think that when they see politicians using the words two states, it just increasingly sounds empty and disconnected from reality and unsatisfying. And so we need to figure out, well, what do we do about that? And I think we need, I think it's fine if organizations still, in a few years say we think a two-state solution is the best, but I would hope we get to a point where people will say, but if Israel closes off that option, then we need to pursue equal rights. And I think we just need to have that conversation of, if the two-state solution actually dies or it's close to death, what does that actually mean? Do we have a responsibility to consider other ways to uphold everyone's freedoms? We can't be in this limbo forever of waiting for something that Israel is actively undermining on the ground to prevent it from taking place.
It always struck me as a bit strange that the Canadian government knows that in Israel, Netanyahu and the other parties are quite clear that there will never be an Arab state. And yet when Netanyahu comes and talks to Mr. Trudeau and says, well, we're all for a two-state solution, we say, yeah, we believe you. There's a bit of hypocrisy there.
I mean, I think it's even worse than that, because I think that sort of support for, or at least not a commitment to a two-state solution, is used against Palestinian activists or the BDS movement, which has an agnostic position of not in favor of any particular solution. That becomes spinned and misinterpreted as seeking the destruction of Israel and as anti-Semitic, and for that reason is something to be condemned. No one asked that same question of Naftali Bennett, who said that he will fight to the end of his life to make sure there's no Palestinian state, and that they'll never give another centimeter to Arabs. No one asks Naftali Bennett why he denies the self-determination of the Palestinian people, and yet Palestinian activists who support, whether it's equal rights or an alternative to two states, in which everyone can live together with equal rights. those people are unfairly maligned with these
Right.
accusations. And so I think that is something, I think, and part of the reason for this report is pointing out that hypocrisy, is pointing out, really trying to get people to understand that so much of the two-state discourse is being maybe upheld by people who don't actually believe it, or who don't, who actually foresee a future in which Palestinians continue to be subordinate
Right.
and unequals under Israeli sovereignty.
Michael, I think it's a significant report. I will put a link to it on my blog post. I wish it would be it will be discussed by Palestinian Canadians, by civil rights groups, human rights organizations in Canada, and I commend you for it. So thank you very much for plopping this out there for discussion.
Thanks so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to dialogue on it, because again, that's really the point of this, is getting a conversation started so that we can break out of the box that our discourse has been trapped in. Hopefully this can play a small role in that.
I hope to talk to you more, follow this discussion, and talk to you some more. Michael Bueckart, Vice President of CJPME. Thank you very much.
Thank you.